The Second World War was a conflict of such magnitude and intensity that it could not spare important leaders and marshals from death, as had been the custom in previous conflicts, and continues to be today. Thus, not only the poor frontline soldiers had to pay the highest price for their military status, but so did the highest-ranking military. Some were forced to commit suicide, others were shot down by the enemy, and finally, there were those whose body simply said enough is enough. In today's program, we are going to analyze how the end of the 5 most famous German field marshals who did not live to see the end of the conflict. These are neither more nor less than Walter Model, von Kluge, von Bock, von Reichenau, and finally the legendary Erwin Rommel. Well, once this presentation is finished, let's start with the first one. Walter Model is a German marshal who needs no introduction, because he undoubtedly stood out for always being present in the most critical place of all. He came to prominence during Operation Barbarossa, in which he was under Guderian's command, and he was seen to be a very capable major general. He later earned Hitler's respect for his defensive actions when the Soviets counterattacked near Moscow in late 1941. From this point on he was able to successfully defend the Rzhev salient, and put a stop to all Soviet offensives launched by Zhukov in said sector. He continued to fight on the Eastern Front until the end of the summer of 1944, participating in the most important actions that took place between the Red Army and the German. After preventing the Soviets from taking Warsaw and stabilizing the front around the Vistula River, he was transferred to the Western Front to try to plug the Allied breach in Normandy. It should be noted that throughout this final stage, Model, like many other German generals, was not having a good time, since bearing the burden of all those defeats, with all the thousands of dead under his command, was not an easy thing. Due to this, some of them, like Model or Rundstedt, resorted to drinking something more than necessary at night. Walter Model was occupying several positions until finally, at the beginning of September, he was appointed commander of Army Group B on the Western Front, being able to disrupt the Market Garden operation, with which Montgomery intended to enter Germany. It was around this time when the result of the war was very against the Germans, since the Third Reich was already completely surrounded on all fronts, when Walter Model issued the following statement to his troops. "Soldiers, we have lost a battle, but I assure you that we will not lose the war. I can't say more at this point, although I know the losses are piling up on their minds. That this has happened is not important, because what counts is not to lose confidence in the future of Germany. At the same time, everyone must understand the seriousness of the situation. This moment will be enough to distinguish the real men from the inept ones. Every soldier has the same responsibilities. If the one who advances falls, another must be ready to take his place in order to continue." From October and November of that year, 1944, everything continued to get worse for Germany, until its last major offensive on the Western Front also failed. At this point, even the most optimistic soldier or general knew that the end was only a matter of time and that it could come at any moment. The Allies finally forced their way across the Rhine, and by mid-April they pocketed more than 300,000 German fighters, in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. With all lost and hopeless, and after both his and his men had been accused of treason by Goebbels, Marshal Walter Model walked into a small copse near Lintorf and committed suicide. One of the last comments he made to his aide just before committing suicide on April 21, 1945 was the following: "I cannot imagine that I, as a field marshal, who, out of conviction in the victory of my country, am responsible for the death of hundreds of my soldiers, I must now emerge from these woods to approach Montgomery, or the Americans, with my hands up and say, 'Hello, here I am. I'm Field Marshal Model and I'm giving up.'" The next marshal on our list is Gunther von Kluge. This marshal is not as popular today as Rommel or Model, but as we will see below, he was very important during World War II. Firstly, he commanded the German Fourth Army during the Polish, French and Barbarossa campaigns. During these operations, he had many brushes with Guderian, and throughout his career he suffered disobedience from his subordinate generals. Later, after the failed German attempt to take Moscow, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Center, a post he would hold for almost 2 years, until the end of 1943. On this occasion he was model superior during Operation Citadel and subsequent battles, also having many confrontations with him. On October 27, 1943, he was in an automobile accident, which forced him to be out of service until July 1944, when he was sent to the Western Front to replace Marshal Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief of the West. Shortly after, the attack against Hitler took place on July 20th, which caused thousands of arrests, and the whole world was put under the magnifying glass of the Gestapo. Little by little the name of Kluge began to circulate as one of the possible implicated and began to investigate him. Although the Marshal had arrived in Normandy in high spirits and promising Hitler that he could take charge of the situation, he soon reported that the German defenses would eventually give way in a few days or weeks. Compounding the situation, on August 15th, Kluge's car was damaged in an Allied bombardment and he was cut off from all contact with his forces for several hours. Hitler immediately suspected that Kluge was negotiating a surrender of his troops with the Allies. He was immediately fired, and 2 days later he was replaced by Model. When he was finally able to reach his headquarters, he was summoned to Berlin for a meeting with Hitler, but Kluge was convinced that he was going to be charged for involvement in the July 20th plot and chose to commit suicide on July 19th, August, using cyanide. In his final testimony, he affirmed his loyalty to Hitler and expressed the opinion that Germany needed to end the war, writing that, "The German people have suffered such incalculable suffering that it is time to put an end to this horror." The third field marshal on the show is Fedor von Bock, who died a very unfortunate death. Unlike the marshals we have just seen who were active during practically the entire conflict, Bock was in service only during the first period of World War II. The first operation he participated in was in Poland as commander of Army Group North. He later received command of Army Group B, and was tasked with carrying out the decoy attack on Belgium and Holland during the Battle of France. Due to this action, on July 19, 1940, he was promoted to Field Marshal. During the following summer he would be in charge of commanding the Army Group Center during Operation Barbarossa, this being the most powerful formation of the German army. Bock was removed from his command on December 19, 1941 after the failure against Moscow, although he was quickly called back to duty to take charge of the situation of Army Group South, after the death of precisely the next marshal that we will see. There, together with Paulus, he was in charge of containing the different Soviet offensives during the Second Battle of Kharkov, later going on the attack in the German attack of 1942, known as Operation Blue. Although this operation began on June 28 with the objective, first of all, of reaching the Volga to protect the eastern flank, and later advancing to the Caucasus, a few days later Hitler decided to divide Army Group South, and ordered advance towards the two objectives simultaneously. This provoked many protests by Bock, who was finally dismissed on July 17, 1942, and did not hold any military position during the rest of the conflict. So, if he no longer commanded an army, how is it possible that he died before the end of World War II? It all happened on May 3, 1945, once Hitler himself was dead, and Berlin had fallen into Soviet hands. Bock had a very good relationship with von Manstein, who told him to come to his residence in Hamburg to speak with him, so that he could try to hold a position in the new government that Admiral Dönitz was organizing. During his road trip, his car was attacked by a British plane, which strafed the vehicle and killed the marshal's entire family on the spot. Although Bock survived this attack, he died the next day from his injuries. The next marshal on our list who died during World War II was a good friend of the famous Paulus, this being Walter von Reichenau. This marshal, as we will see below, also had a tragic double death. His story during this conflict begins with the German attack on Poland in 1939, in which Reichenau commands the German 10th Army. Later he returns to participate in the Battle of France commanding the German 6th Army, which leads him to be promoted to Field Marshal along with other generals such as von Bock himself, Keitel or Kluge. During the following summer he continued to command the 6th Army within Army Group South. After Rundstedt's dismissal in November of that same year due to the difficulties encountered by the Germans in their advance towards Rostov, Reichenau took his place. It is noteworthy that this marshal was one of Hitler's favorites at the time. Unfortunately for him, he could not spend much time at the controls of the South Army Group, because on January 14, 1942 he suffered a stroke while carrying out his routine career at about 20 degrees below zero. Because Hitler insisted that the German marshal be treated by good German doctors, Reichenau was transferred 2 days later to a more rear position, having the bad luck that the plane suffered an accident. Finally, Walter von Reichenau died on January 17, it being unclear whether it was from his stroke or injuries from the plane crash. And finally we go with the fifth marshal of our program, being this Erwin Rommel, who needs no introduction. As you all know, after his actions in France in 1940, and later in North Africa, Rommel was sent to defend the Atlantic Wall in France in November 1943. After months of reinforcing the defenses, Rommel ended up facing the Allies when they landed in Normandy in June 1944. After the first weeks in which the invasion could not be repulsed, Rommel became increasingly aware that the only solution for Germany was reach a peace before the situation became even more critical. This was stated to Hitler over and over again, being branded by the German leader as defeatist. On July 17, when the German defenses in Normandy were about to give way, Rommel was attacked by a Canadian plane that nearly cost him his life. A few days later the attack against Hitler took place, and because many men close to Rommel were arrested, it did not take long for the German marshal to be linked to the plot as well. Generals Bergdorf and Mazel finally visited Rommel at his home on October 14, 1944, while he continued to recover from his injuries. Bergdorf informed him of the charges against him and offered him 3 options. In the first place, he could choose to defend himself personally against Hitler in Berlin. Secondly, he could face the People's Court. Lastly, he had the option of committing suicide. If he chose the latter, which he did, his family and all his possessions would be respected, and he would receive a full honors funeral. Thus, on October 14, Rommel committed suicide in the back seat of the car of the generals who had come to inform him. Well, so far this program, which I hope has been interesting. If you want to expand this information, I leave you in the description the direct that we have with Antonio Munoz on Rommel. Thank you all for being a part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other again here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.